All right, so we will go ahead and get started. Thanks again for coming. Today we'll be finishing off the last VFR workshop, and we'll be focusing on Class Bravo and Charlie scenarios. The goal of each scenario will be to discuss the aspects of flight planning that pertain to that flight. So how would we go about planning that flight? What would a reasonable route look like? How would we fly it? What are the airspace considerations? How do we navigate it? And then what are we likely to say during each phase of flight? What would we expect the controller to say back? And we'll probably go through a couple of branches. If the controller says option A, then how would we react? If they say option B, then what would we do differently? And that will be pretty much the format throughout. The one thing that will be new this time, time permitting, which I'm going to move fairly quickly, we're going to cover a couple of the Bravo transitions, and one of them is going to be very long, in the order of 600 miles. And given that our first workshop I think went about 40 miles, and it took me 2 hours. So we only covered 20 miles an hour. So unless anyone wants to stick around for 30 hours to hear me talk about a flight, we obviously have to do things differently. And the goal of picking a 600-mile flight was to show that you can actually do flight planning fairly rapidly. Once you know what to look for, you can do some fairly high-level planning and high-level route selection that will get you on your way fairly quickly. And so we're going to review a real-world flight that I did out of a Class Bravo airport, which is why I chose it for this workshop, but I also chose it for its relatively long distance. So I'm looking forward to covering that one. So this will be a little bit different in that sense. We'll be covering some ground and seeing how we plan differently when it's when it's a much longer flight. All right, let's go ahead and get started then. So here's what we covered in the past. These were our scenarios. We covered non-towered departure and arrival airport. That was the part one of the workshop. Then we covered Class Deltas, departure and arrivals, one with flight following, one without. The notes for that are now available on the website. If you click on PilotEdge.net and click on the workshops link, you'll see a list of past and future workshops. Feel free to have a look at part 2 of the workshop, and there are some relatively detailed notes about at least the first flight, the one without flight following, that are available. And here we are optimistically, as you can see, listing part 3 for both the Class Charlie departure and arrival and the Class Bravo departure and arrival. So let's go ahead and get started with the Class Charlies. Okay, I chose this one very, very specifically. This is going to be John Wayne to Ontario, and this is the famous V2 rating, or infamous V2 rating from our pilot training program. So we offer a pilot training program. I don't think I have to explain too much of it because half of the people in this room have obviously participated in the pilot training program. But for those that are watching after the fact and aren't familiar with it, on PilotEdge we have a series of 3 VFR flights, at least at the moment it's 3 VFR flights and 11 IFR flights that are available, where ATC will not only act as ATC, but they'll also act as a designated pilot examiner. Spanky, your mic is hot. Can you either mute or swap to push to talk? And so ATC will act as a designated pilot examiner along those flights. The first rating, the V1, is 3 laps of the pattern at any towered airport. Doesn't usually give people too many problems, and that's the idea. It's supposed to be an icebreaker to build people's confidence. And then apparently in the V2 rating, we take that confidence and step all over it and throw it in the trash, because the V2 rating gives people quite a bit of angst. So that was why I chose this scenario this evening for the Class Charlie, because it's one that a lot of people have studied in the past. So let's dive right on into it. Okay. Calvin, thanks for the note. I'm told that you actually can see Join Me's from the iPad, so that is good to know. All right, so here is our the airport we'll be starting from, and for those that aren't familiar, we'll go through this very briefly for each session. I'm using skyvector.com, an excellent site for online charts and basic flight planning, and I'm going to turn on my little cheat line to show roughly the directional flight where we're going, and eventually we'll turn that off. Okay, and to minimize the amount of scrolling, sorry, or video compression artifacts, I will minimize the amount of scrolling that I do. So forgive that little mistake I made before, but this should remain relatively static from this point on. I'm sensitive to people who don't have a lot of bandwidth, so we'll leave it as it is right here. So here we are starting at the south end of it. We're looking at the Los Angeles terminal area chart, the TAC chart, and we're going to be going from the John Wayne Airport, which is a Class Charlie, over to Ontario, which is a Class Charlie over here. 26-mile flight, so at 120 knots, any guesses roughly how long this is going to take? You can answer on text so that we don't get a cacophony of voices. And no, nobody's allowed to cheat and use a calculator. Yes, 100 and at 120 knots. So Spanky, you're doing 120 knots to go 26 miles. Okay. Yep, they're all very good answers. Jacob is having a stroke or heart attack. So that's one of the beautiful things about the speed at which a Cessna tends to fly, 120 miles, 120 knots, is it's very conveniently that is 2 miles a minute. So 60 knots is 1 mile per minute, because there are 60 minutes an hour. If you're doing 60 miles an hour or 60 knots, that is 1 nautical mile per minute. And then you just keep multiplying by 2s. So 60 times 2 is 120. That's 2 miles a minute. Add on another 60, get to 180. So 180 knot aircraft does about 3 miles a minute. 240 knot aircraft does about 4 miles a minute. Don't worry about getting it exact. Just those little numbers can be very, very handy when you're in flight for estimating roughly how long this flight should take. So once we're on our way and in cruise in our trusty 172, all things being equal, we'd expect about 13 minutes or so to get to Ontario. And Reese is quite right. By the time you do pattern departures and the slower climb and get vectored around by ATC, it may well end up being 20 minutes from wheels up to wheels down. But in terms of en route time in a straight line, we're looking at about 13 minutes. Okay, so let's begin with our usual approach. We're going to look at the route planning. We'll take into account the airspace a little bit, but primarily I want to focus on how we're going to navigate the airplane. There'll be a little bit of repetition of the technique that we've used on previous workshops, but it is such an important one. I think it's worth reinforcing it. So, and we do only have maybe 2 scenarios to get through, so there is time to do some basic route planning. So before I drill way down and have a look, the first thing that stands out to me is there's a fairly prevalent mountain range over here. So at Santiago Peak, or Santiago, is it a B or a G? I don't want to zoom in because I don't want to screw up everyone's map, but there is a peak here that's 5,700 feet. John Wayne is down at, for all intents and purposes, sea level. Ontario is up at about 1,000 feet. By the way, someone still does have a hot mic occasionally. Again, make sure no voice activation, or if you are voice activated, make sure the mic's muted. And so what I would use instinctively is try and find the corner of that range. So we see that the peak is up here at 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet, 4,000 feet over at Pleasant's Peak. And so once you get to the northwest corner of that range, it comes down to a much more reasonable level. So as long as we keep that mountain range just off of our right, we'll do a fairly good job of navigating along that course, all things being equal. And yes, for those that are curious, the workshop is being recorded this evening, thanks to Mr. Mark Hargrove, which we appreciate. So from a navigation standpoint, I'm going to keep that mountain range off the right. That's about the halfway point. There we go. So it's 15 miles from John Wayne to the edge of the peak, and then 12 miles, so very close to halfway. So that's 15 miles, that's about 7.5 minutes. That's a reasonable distance. So by the time we take off and turn around, assuming about 10 miles visibility, it wouldn't be that long before you're able to see this peak, and all we have to do is try and make out the corner of the range and keep that just off of our right, and we'll be navigating fairly well. While we're doing that, another technique that I've I mentioned briefly, I think, during the first workshop, but haven't mentioned since, is the notion of using landmarks without actually flying directly over them. When I first started planning flights, I would pick a landmark. Let's take Irvine Lake, and it is now time to zoom in, so I'm going to do that. That's actually pretty good there, I think. Okay, so when I was first learning to fly, I'd say, oh, Irvine Lake, great, let's fly directly over Irvine Lake. Two problems with that. One, if you're planning the flights by hand, which you will be as a student pilot, you'll have to do wind correction angles and fuel burn, all of those things for every leg of the flight. If you end up creating, just for argument's sake, 5 legs that are all within plus or minus 3 degrees, you have to go and redo all your math for those legs. You have to work out the crosswind correction and everything by hand and write it down on paper, and it can be exhausting. So when you can fly a straight line, it's better to fly a straight line than it is to make really small deviations. So that's one advantage, just from a practical student pilot perspective. It is worth keeping them as straight as you can, unless you enjoy the math. The other advantage is, I'm not sure if the planes that you fly have a glass bottom in them, but none of the planes that I fly do. And so trying to find an object that is directly in front of you, exactly, Chris has got it, he's saying it right at the same time I am. I've learned this the hard way. Once it's, if you're up at 5,000 feet or 3,000 feet, once the object drops below the nose, you've lost it. And so it's very hard to know when you're directly over it. And from a timing standpoint, it is important to know when you've reached a checkpoint. And that can be difficult if you're going to fly right over it. So don't be shy. In fact, you should intentionally try and pass these things slightly to the left or the right. Ideally to the left, because if you're sitting in the left seat, it's easier to look down off the left side than it is the right. But if you have to do it on the right, that's fine too. And so that's another reason that it's a good idea to keep these reporting points off to the side. So at a glance, I would say John Wayne, head out to the northeast, look out for Irvine Lake as a short-range checkpoint, and our first turning point is going to be the edge of the peak here. We'll back that up with the highway, which will be running from west to east, and there'll be a fairly significant set of squiggles along that highway. It doesn't appear as though there are any other major roads in that area. There does appear to be a train line just to the side of it, so we'll be looking for a train line and a road with some, or a highway with major squiggles in it. And that would be kind of good enough to identify this area, in my mind at least. Anyone have any major anxiety about the routing that we've picked so far, just from a pure flight planning perspective? Okay. There's a freeway to follow under the magenta line. Yep. So Mark has suggested there's a freeway to follow. Mark, you referring to the one that runs north and then turns to the east? I want the runs further east. Yep. That's true. There is a freeway out here. Correct. So we can be looking for that below us as well. So one cautious thing about roads is that sometimes there can be too many of them. So if you have a bunch of parallel roads in a grid, it can be hard to spot one from the other. So if you're going to use roads, make sure they're relatively distinctive. So here we have just west of Irvine Lake, we have a junction of 2 that turns into 1, and then that freeway continues up north. So that will work pretty well. As it turns out, some of this is not going to be practical because for those that have flown the V2, you'll know that if you're heading northeast out of John Wayne, anyone remember the rough heading that they give you? And you get an assigned radar heading by the clearance delivery controller. Yes, the victims of the V2 are chiming in now on text. That's right. So you're going to be heading towards Disneyland for a while anyway, and you'll be released, just for those that are curious, you'll be released generally right around here where my mouse is. So if tower is on the ball and gets you off to departure, our flight is actually going to begin, in quotes, over here near Garden Grove, not near John Wayne. That's something you want to be aware of when you're departing in some of the busier airports. Well, let's start with not a busy airport. You start with Corona, for example, over here. You take off and you plan any heading you like, and you're in pretty good shape. You're in control of your own destiny from the time the wheels leave the ground. And that becomes less and less true at the more complex airports. So at a class Delta, you may be able to go where you want to go. At a class Charlie, not so much. At a class Bravo, almost never. So you have to be a little bit flexible and not too panicky when you have to throw away the first part of your plan which can make navigation a little bit treacherous. If you're not using GPS, when you have a radar heading, they're putting you on a heading, and so it's easy to get complacent and say, well, I'm on a heading, I'll just do what ATC says. Well, 5 miles later, they say, adios, Buster, and they drop you off, and they say, resume on navigation. So it's good to know where you are when you're on that radar heading. And yep, Chris points out a good reason for fuel reserves. That's right. It's not just wind that can eat up your gas. It's also routing from ATC. That is very, very true. Okay, so let's see. I'll continue with the flight planning now. So we've made it quite happily to this area around just east of Santa Ana Canyon. I'm going to scroll up to Ontario. Now this is quite a serious combination. Half of the people that do not pass the V2 do not pass the V2 because they end up making a spectacular landing at the Chino airport. So Chino, when you're approaching from the south, has 2 parallel runways running left to right. Ontario, when you're approaching from the south, has 2 parallel runways running left to right. And that startling similarity has been the downfall of many a V2 pilot. So that's something to keep in mind. The secret here is that Chino has 3 runways, Ontario has 2. So that's something to keep in mind. That's one of those cases where timing the legs can be very important. So you should know that it is about 6 minutes from Santa Ana Canyon, after you make the dog leg to the left, it should be about 6 minutes before you're over the top of Ontario, and maybe about 5 minutes before you're entering the downwind. So that would be about 2 miles out if we subtract a minute. So 5 minutes you should be entering the downwind. If you're entering the downwind after 2.5 minutes, you've either jumped into a Columbia or you have gotten a very stiff tailwind. It's unlikely that there would have been a massive shift in winds between where we were here and where we were here, and that slight dogleg to the left wouldn't account for such a massive increase in speed. So you remember from some of the earlier workshops I talked about the huge importance of timing your legs when you're seriously doing these flights, and the timing can be the thing that rules out a possible checkpoint. As you're passing over it and you think, boy, is that Ontario? Look at your watch. No, that can't be Ontario. Or you should at least be suspicious as to whether that's Ontario or not. Great way to resolve that one. Hey, approach, is that Chino in front of me or Ontario? Or is that Ontario right in front of me that I'm seeing? And don't be afraid to ask them if you don't have somebody next to you to ask. Or consult the GPS or look for other landmarks. But the timing itself should raise a massive red flag, and then how you resolve that is really up to you. Okie dokie, we're on a left turn, and I'll be looking for the Chino airport. I'll be looking for this road. Over here, the highway, we'll be crossing over the highway, and it should be drifting off to our left and eventually becomes useless. We'd be looking basically for the Chino airport, and then beyond that, the Ontario airport. This is a hugely built-up area. You can tell by all the yellow. Yellow means it's a congested area. And so the fact that there's an airport in the middle of a congested area can actually be really, it makes it very, very easy to, find. Has anyone got a good technique who's flown before? How do you spot the airport in urban areas when you're approaching from a distance? Does anything stand out in terms of its contrast from the surrounding area? Awesome. Yep, I agree. So Chris has said it's an open space and it's darker. Reese said generally it's a big open field. That's exactly right. And it's exactly the opposite of what I thought I'd be looking for when I was learning to fly. I thought the airport would be the big thing that looks like an airport. So whenever you go to an airport as a passenger, the airport seems massive and sprawling and it would be easy to see. In fact, when you get up to altitude, the airport is very non-distinct. It's almost like a pasture in the middle of these urban areas. So these airports can be relatively easy to find. A big airport in the middle of an urban area is going to be the thing that looks like there's absolutely nothing there. So don't look for the runways. You won't see the runways till you're basically too close to do much about it other than enter the pattern. But in terms of spotting a field from any kind of distance, say 5+ miles, just look for the big old patch of nothing. Again, that was completely non-intuitive for me. It took me a while to realize that. My instructor had to point it out to me at the time. But it has been consistent ever since. Okay, so I think we've planned our flight, and as Mark pointed out, for the 3rd workshop out of 4, I think there has been a prison along our route of flight. So this has become little trademark thing of our workshops. We also always seem to be overflying prison. So if we break our minimum altitude rules or break enough FARs, we can always just land at Chino and go straight to jail. Okay. Anybody have any grave concerns about the navigability of the route of flight? Not concerned about airspace at this point. Just looking out the window and navigating the flight. Have I missed anything significant, do you think? That's not a trick question. I don't think I have, but I'm just curious if anyone has. If anyone has any thought about it. All right. Okay. So yeah, the navigation is not. This is not a difficult flight from a navigation standpoint. It's really more the airspace considerations and the fact that you get thrown for a bit of a loop. So now let's look at the airspace. So I'm going to zoom out. And we're good. I'm going to take an advice from a while ago, and when you're approaching these, don't be shy about using a fly chart if one is available. They're not available everywhere, but in busy terminal areas, which is where you need them the most, they are, and they can be really, really great from in terms of analyzing airspace. So if you're done looking at the chart from a terrain and navigation point of view, there's a better chart than the TAC chart when it to analyze airspace. So if we attempt to use the TAC chart and you're just looking at this, my initial reaction is, my goodness, there's a lot of stuff here. This is going to be a pain. Maybe I should just go IFR, honestly. If I'm feeling very lazy, that's what I would do. But if, on closer inspection, you start piecing it together, it's really not that bad, but the initial glance is not great. And the reason is we've got so much overlying airspace. We've got deltas and charlies. There's a delta, 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 delta. So in fact, there's two that I didn't point out, three that I didn't point out, but there's a bunch of deltas. We've got the really bizarre LA Bravo with its 58,000 shells. We've got the Mode C Veil at 30 miles from LA, which tells you that you need a Mode C transponder if you're going to operate inside that 30-mile ring. We have all these frequency notifications. We have compass roses because there's a gazillion and one VORs. This is a complex chart, even more so than the airspace itself. So let's swap over to the fly chart and see the difference. Still pretty ugly now that I look about it, but an improvement, I think. So the airspace stands out a lot more. The terrain kind of goes away, and now it's all about the airspace. So you can see the shelves a lot more clearly than before, and we're not concerned so much about the terrain. So we haven't done this in the flight planning session, but I'd like to try and use the flight chart for discussing the airspace. I have to be honest, I've never looked at a flight chart for more than about 5 seconds. I always look at them and go, cool, I should come and look at that another time, and I never come back to it. So I'm going to force myself to use it for this session. All right, so let's look at our airspace consideration. We are going from a Class Charlie to a Class Charlie airport. All right, so let's find out what are the tops, just a quick quiz, what are the tops of the Charlie airspace? And real-world pilots are not allowed to answer that one. So if you're already a rated pilot, please don't answer it. Let's give the people who are still, people who are kind of new to this a chance to answer them too. Fish Jacob. Okay, so the question is, what are the tops of the John Wayne Charlie airspace, and what's the top of the Ontario Charlie airspace? Good. Are those AGL or MSL? Okay, lots of very quick responses. Very good. All the altitudes are good, and the MSLs, AGLs are almost all right. Matt, I'm going to give you a hint. If you're ever sure if a reported number is, if you're ever not sure if a reported number is AGL or MSL, go to Denver. I cannot tell you how many times I've used this trick. So here I am at Denver. Denver's a relative high airport. You'll notice that the first outer shelf, so these are, I'm not sure how many Bravos you looked at, but the way they work with the inverted wedding cake is the bottom shelves get higher and higher as you go out. But the first one just outside of the Bravo, normally only a couple of 1,000 feet high. What do you notice about the first, what's the lowest first shelf around Denver, right here. Correct, 6,000. So what are the chances that that's actually 6,000 feet AGL? Pretty slim. When you look at these runways here, almost actually impossible. You would not be flying at say 2,000 or 3,000 feet AGL here without being able to talk to ATC. That's right, Chris. That's correct. So because Denver is so high, Denver is is 5,000 feet high. These numbers make a lot more sense. So this 6,000 foot shelf is actually 1,000 feet AGL, which is what I would expect to see. So here's our answer right away, just using the process of elimination, without even looking up the definition of these symbols. I can put my hand over my heart, and I'd bet my ticket that these are MSL, not AGL. Another time I've done that is with clouds. If you're ever unsure if clouds are listed as MSL or AGL, same thing. Okay, so if we're curious, see how in the Denver METAR it says few clouds 4,500. Well, is that AGL or MSL? We know Denver is 5,000 feet high, so there's no way that cloud is 500 feet below the ground. So that must be AGL. So the clouds are AGL, but the airspace is MSL. All right, and we're back. Okay, so our study of the chart of the procedures tells us, or the transcript tells us that we can expect the 330 heading. But I'd like to, as a confidence build, let's say we didn't know. We truly didn't know that we were going to put on a 330 heading. That information is not that easy to come by, and I don't want the rating to kind of cheat in that sense and give us information we wouldn't have known. So if we're going to plan to depart south out of John Wayne, we know we're going to want to make most likely a right downwind departure. That makes the most sense. And so now we're going to think about what altitude are we going to use for this flight, and who we're going to talk to, and are we going to use flight following. Well, for the V2, the goal of the V2 is to coordinate flight following. That was covered pretty exhaustively in the last workshop, so we don't have to go through that in too much detail. If people want me to go through that again, I will do it during the Q&A in as much detail as we want. Since it turned out it wasn't recorded, but I think we ended up getting flight following in the first workshop, so that is covered there. But we'll talk about the altitude we want to use. I'd say 3,500 or 5,500 would be fine, depending on the type of airplane. Probably 3,500 in a 172, or maybe even just 3,000. Let's have a look at the terrain real quick. Now we are VFR, so the sector altitudes here, or the minimum safe altitudes within these sectors, we are passing through one that has a 4,500, and this one has 6,100. We're not really going to pass through the one that has 6,100. That really only applies here, and that's obviously because of the peak over here at 5,700 feet. So I remember mentioning in a previous workshop, when you see these numbers, these are not regulatory. You're not bound to fly at 4,500 above. These are just purely from a flight planning perspective. If you really didn't want to look at the terrain too closely, you could say, all right, at 4,500 feet within this grid, I'm not going to hit anything, period. But we may not want to go up to, well, 4,500 feet wouldn't work in this case for the direction of flight. We're going eastbound, so we need an odd number of 1,000 plus 500 if we're going to be above 3,000 feet AGL. And so I'd say 3,000 would work. There is a peak there at 3,045 feet. I'm not concerned about hitting it because we're VFR. Believe me, if you're worried about hitting terrain when you're VFR because you can't see it, it's probably not a good day to go in terms of visibility. So that shouldn't be too much of a factor. IFR, it's a different matter. But for VFR, it's don't worry too much about the terrain, especially when you have many landing options to the left. So I want to mention that as a caveat. If everything around here was 3,000 feet AGL, we would be going through it at 3,000 or 3,500 because now you're not leaving much room if there's an engine failure. And there is a regulation in terms of minimum altitudes that says you will fly not so low so that if you have an engine failure, you cause undue risk to people or property on the ground. And so it's actually illegal to be flying so low over the terrain that you don't leave yourself with any options, assuming there's people and property that you might hit. So 3,500 could be fine because we've got we've got the highway, we've got some patches of nothing that are lower down on the left. So I'd say 3,000 or 3,500 will work. Anyone feel strongly that it should be significantly lower or significantly higher than 3,000 or 3,500? Okay, and there's a question regarding the flight following. Why do you have to request VFR advisories instead of flight following when calling clearance delivery for the V2 rating? You can use those terms interchangeably as far as I'm concerned. VFR advisories and flight following and radar services, practically speaking, are all the same thing. So call it whatever you would like. It's not an issue. Okay, Calvin has said that we cannot use 3,000. Okay, why can we not use 3,000? Okay, so the rule regarding VFR altitude, so this is important because I would not want you to not fly a flight at 3,000 because you thought you weren't allowed to do it. The rules for VFR cruising altitudes apply once you reach 3,000 feet AGL. So assuming that this terrain is at least 1 foot above sea level or more, then we can fly at 3,000 all day long. It's not an issue. So those rules don't kick in. So if you want to go at, let's ignore terrain for a minute. If you wanted to go at 1,300 feet, 1,500 feet, 17, 21, 2,250, pick any random number between 1 and 3,000, ignoring the terrain for a moment. You can fly at any of those altitudes. It's only once you reach 3,000 feet AGL that you need to be concerned about the cruising altitude. So 3,000 feet, generally speaking, is going to be fine, except when you're, well, it's going to be fine. Okay, so I think we're good, but with either 3,000 or 3,500. So we've got our altitude picked out, we've got our route picked out. We're going to do this with flight following because if we're going to be in the Charlie, and 3,000 is going to put us in the Charlie when we're in the inner core, are we going to be in the outer core of the Charlie given the current depicted route? Let me give you the fly chart. So are we going to be in the outer core? So here we have the inner core, and here we have the outer core of the John Wayne Charlie. Are we going to be in that outer core if we're at 3? Yes. Okay. So we're going to need to be talking to ATC anyway, and as we continue at 3, how are things looking over at sunny Ontario? Are we going to be in the outer core of the Ontario Charlie if we're at 3? Yep, exactly. So here's the space where we don't need to be talking to ATC. It's about the length of the driveway that I one day hope to own. Not very, this is not a lot of room. So doing this without flight following for the altitude and route we have picked doesn't make any sense because the minute we drop it, just before it gets sent to Annie Canyon, we then have to hurriedly pick it up again with potentially a different controller here for the Ontario Charlie. So practically speaking, we're just going to get flight following for the entire route. So the good news is, what happens to these Charlies when we're already talking to ATC? From a simplistic perspective, yep, they disappear. They don't matter. Exactly. A lot of people saying that at the same time. That's good stuff. Correct. Things get very simple if you're talking to ATC. So the advantage of departing from a Charlie is you've got a head start on the poor buggers who took off out of, say, Corona and wanted to just transition the Charlie to go to Torrance. They have to establish contact with ATC. They're doing some work. We're already talking to the right people. By the time we're talking to clearance delivery, we're talking to the people who can get us the flight following through this and get us in touch with ATC. So as complex as this seems, once you have the flight following, the Charlies kind of go away, and getting the flight following is going to be really easy from the ground. So as complex as this appears from the outset, ends up being relatively simple. So let's talk then through the comms, and then we'll actually be done with this scenario. The comms probably will bring up more questions than the route has so far, but so let's go ahead and go through them. I'm going to pull up the facility diagram for John Wayne. My old friend. Spent a lot of time looking it up here. For such a little, it's surprisingly complicated. 1,000,001 frequencies on the left. Surprising how many people don't look at these. I'm guessing they're either not sure what side of the airport they're on, or they're not looking at a airport diagram that actually gives them the meanings of the different frequencies. But we almost see people calling the different frequencies at random, to be honest. So we'll have people on the west side of the airport, that's over here where my mouse is, and they'll call 120.8 for ground. That's for the east side, and vice versa. Now on PilotEdge, I'll be honest, the chances of east and west being staffed by different people are very slim, realistically. But it's not a habit that you want to get into. So you will reach a controller and he or she may not even notice, quite honestly, that you're on the wrong ground frequency. They may just give you the taxi anyway, or they may gently point it out. But you can believe that if you're at John Wayne during a big push, when they have tons of traffic, they will have a separate west and east ground controller, and if you call the west controller from the east side, he or she will be very, very puzzled and maybe not thrilled. So it's a good practice to get the right one. Does it matter that much on PE? Not really, but we're going to try and make it matter just from a training perspective. Okay, so we'd start off by getting the ATIS 126.0. Find out what the weather's doing. In real life, that would give us what runways are in use. Almost certainly John Wayne will be departing south. It's pretty rare that they go to north operations, so standard configuration is for 19 left and right. And then we'll swap over to clearance delivery to pick up flight following. This does vary from Class C to Class C, and I bet if we asked every real pilot where they've flown how Class C, whether they call delivery or ground, you're going to hear every answer imaginable. So I have tried to determine a pattern, and I have not been able to, quite honestly. There's only one pattern that I've almost picked up on is if you call ground, you're rarely going to get yelled at unless there's something that ATIS, I have heard ATISs that specifically say VFR aircraft departing, VFR departures contact clearance delivery for VFR departure instructions. So that message implies that, the lack of that message at some places, some Class Cs, implies that maybe you could just call ground with your initial request. So clearance delivery is explicitly for delivering IFR clearances. If you're looking to pick up an IFR clearance, no doubt about it, call the clearance delivery frequency. That's 100% accurate all the time when clearance delivery frequency exists. Where it gets muddy is if you'd like to do a VFR departure with advisories from a Class C, there are some places that are going to want you to call clearance delivery. At Deltas, I have not seen a Delta that has you call clearance delivery to pick up your flight following. So if you see a clearance delivery at a Class Delta, typically you'd still call ground for the taxi and your flight following request. But at the Charlies, it seems to be 6 one, half a dozen of the other. So I wouldn't sweat it too much, honestly. You're probably not going to get yelled at. Depends on the mood of the controller. If you do call ground, maybe they'll tell you to call clearance. If you call clearance, I doubt they're going to tell you to call ground. So why don't we go with that as a rule? If you're starting out at a Charlie and you want the flight following, I would call clearance delivery to pick that up. That you'll rarely be too far wrong, I suppose. As to why it's different, Moon, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know why there seems to be inconsistency among the facilities around that. That'll be something I'm going to try and dig into a little bit. So I'll speak to a couple of real facilities. I'll have some opportunities to do that soon. In fact, I'm visiting Teterboro Tower tomorrow morning, so I will ask them now that I think about it. They're a Delta, but they'll probably have some good experience with that. Maybe they'll know the answer regarding the Charlies. Okay, so we'll call clearance delivery and we'll tell them that we are in whatever kind of airplane. So let's pretend we're doing the Cessna 172 and we're 123 Alpha Bravo and we're parked over at the West FBO, so down here. The call would be something along the lines of John Wayne Ground, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, with the numbers request flight following to Ontario at 3000. That would do the trick. Matt, I'll talk to you about that when at the end. Okay, so the clearance delivery controller will assign a departure heading if one applies. So here's the sorts of things you can expect to hear. And again, the busier the airport you go to, the more restrictions you may get. So out of a sleep class D, they'll just give you departure frequency whatever and transponder whatever. So they'll give you a code to squawk and a departure frequency, and that's about it. But as you get to the more complex airports and airspace, they'll start issuing headings, so headings and potentially altitudes. So be prepared to copy those down. They start sounding dangerously like an VFR clearance, actually. Just the routing is a lot simpler. Okay, so the departure instruction is going to sound something along the lines of, says 3 Alpha Bravo, John Wayne, clearance after departure, turn right heading 330, maintain VFR at or below 2,400 until advised. Departure frequency will be with the tower initially, squawk, and whatever the code is. There are not many places that do that, but John Wayne has an actual radar position in the tower that's separate to the regular TRACON duties. Think of it as like a very, very small approach sector that's kind of mixed with the tower. I need to find out in real world if that's on a different frequency or not. It's not listed here on this facility, but I want to go listen to the feeds and find out. But every now and then you might hear something along those lines. So instead of hearing departure frequency 127.2, which is what IFR departures get, that's the bona fide TRACON controller covering quite a bit of airspace. Instead, the tower controller here actually has radar and can radar identify you. It's a fully radar-enabled tower. Teterboro is also like that. So not often will you hear a tower issue radar contact, but it does happen. And so that's what's going to happen in this case. So if you're ever noticing, hey, that's interesting, at John Wayne, whenever I take off, they keep me with the tower when I'm VFR, and the tower radar identifies me. That's different. So that's the reason for that. There's actually a radar position there within the tower. Okay, so we will read that back. So it's Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo after departure heading 330, out or below 2,400, departure with the tower, and squawk whatever the code was. And also read back correct, expect runway 19 right, because we told them we were on the west side potentially, so they'll say 19 right. That's the closest runway. And so we'll swap over to ground and make the call. John Wayne Ground, Cessna 123, Alpha Bravo, west side with the numbers, taxi. We don't have to give them the direction of flight, any of that. You can assume that there's been coordination miraculously between the person who gave you your VFR departure instructions is going to create a strip and pass it down the line to the ground controller. And so the minute you say John Wayne Ground, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, his or her eyes, the ground controller's eyes, should look down into the strip bay and go, okay, this is this plane. And within each facility, they'll have their own little hieroglyphics that they'll write on the strip when they pass them down the line to represent where the plane is, what the request is. I've talked to different facilities and they use completely different shorthands, so it really depends on the facility. But the short version is you can expect some coordination to have taken place, so there's no need to repeat everything. In fact, you could theoretically remove the location, I suppose. You could just say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo is ready for taxi. Any guesses as to what taxi route we might get? So remember, one of the skills that we talked about in an earlier workshop was trying to anticipate what's coming. The more you can anticipate, then the more prepared you'll be. If the comms are scratchy, if you're nervous, whatever it is, the more you've prepared for, the more you can piece it together. And what they're saying becomes more of a confirmation of what you expected, as opposed to, oh geez, what did they just say? Where is that? Right. So good news. There's really only one taxiway to get us to 19 right. That's correct. So the guesses of Bravo Lima or Bravo Kilo are all correct. We know it's going to be Bravo something. And I guess one thing to keep in mind is it's a 5,700-foot runway. Perhaps they might assign, I haven't seen it, but I guess it's technically possible. They could ask you if you'd like Juliet, or if you're a renter and you're in a hurry, you're paying Hobbs time, whatever it is, whatever pressures you have, if you feel comfortable about taking off with less than full length of runway And we won't get into the pluses or minuses of that right now, but if you would like something shorter and you don't want a taxi, or if you see a bunch of jets, let's say there are jets lined up along Lima and all the way down Bravo to say halfway between Kilo and Juliet, there's a huge line of jets, you can pretty much bet those are IFR. And it might be a while before they get out. So that might be an actual time to request. Can we get one on right at Juliet? Is that going to guarantee that you get up before the jets? No. If the thing that's stopping them would also stop you from getting out, then it's not going to help you. However, it could just be that there's a jet with a problem up there, and the ones behind them are just stuck. So it's not that there's a delay getting out of the airport due to airspace congestion that would affect you. It's just literally somebody has got a flat tire, one of their packs isn't working, they've got a passenger in the restroom, which happens on the big jets when they've been sitting for a while and they can't go anywhere until that person's out. All of those things could affect. So I know it seems a little bit esoteric, but it's worth talking about what options are available to you. So all these are all the little tools in your toolbox that you can store away. And in 5 years from now, when you see that line of jets there, you might go, oh, that's right. We can always just pick an intersection. And Mark pointing out some airports won't allow midfield departures. Monterey, for example, won't do it. Correct. I didn't actually know that, Mark. I've only requested it a couple of times and they've said yes, so that's definitely taught me something new. Maybe there are SOPs that they don't allow them for some reason. Do you have any idea, Mark, why they don't allow them? I don't know. So I know you said your mic's not working, so you might type. So while Mark is potentially typing, Ryan says wake turbulence. Yes, I suppose. Although I guess that would be up to the pilot more than anything else. But it might, maybe from a liability standpoint, maybe if there are lots of jets departing, they don't want props starting their takeoff roll late. So for those that aren't as familiar with wake turbulence separation, you want to be above or beside the wake of a jet. So the wake starts at the same altitude as the jet and sinks downward. A very bad place to be is below the jet where its wake has been. So if you start your takeoff roll at the same place as the jet did, guaranteed you'll be off the ground before that jet was off the ground. So now you're above the wake that is coming up. And now you have your options. You can offset to the left or to the right or start an early turn, whatever it is. I've used all of those in the past. You lose that flexibility if you start your takeoff roll from Juliet. So if you start your roll from Juliet, for not long after you get off the ground, you could be in the wake that those jets have left in the past. So that's, yeah, I think Mark, you're probably correct, and I think Ryan, you're probably right. It's most likely to do with wake turbulence. I might actually ask about that. So Matt has asked, what does it mean when you're holding short and they say waiting for release? Very briefly, because I'm watching the time. Very briefly, the tower is not going to give you a takeoff clearance at most facilities. There are exceptions, but at most facilities, if you're IFR or VFR with flight following out of a Charlie or a Bravo, because you are going to be separated. There are radar separation standards for VFR aircraft in Bravo and Charlie. So in Bravo and Charlie, you may not be allowed to take off until the tower controller has checked with the next controller on the line and has said, hey, I'm going to launch one off of 19 right. This is who he is. This is where he's going. And the departure controller will look around, scan the airspace, and make the determination whether that plane can go yes or no. So if you pull up to the line and the controller says runway 19 right, line up and wait, awaiting IFR release, there's your answer. You're going to be waiting for a little while they coordinate getting you off the ground. Okay, looking through the answers, they're all valid answers too. Okie dokie, I better keep things moving along lest I run out of time because there's some cool stuff to cover. Okay, so let's see, we taxi to 19 right via Bravo Lima. We're not surprised about that at all. And then we swap over to tower. And go ahead and swap from ground to tower once you arrive in short of the runway. There is nothing fundamentally the ground controller needs to give you once you're over there. There's an expectation that you'll swap to tower on your own. And so if the ground controller needed to keep you on the frequency, he or she would know that as you're taxiing on Bravo, they know they're going to lose you to tower pretty soon. If they have an operational need to keep you on the frequency, they'll tell you that. And so they'll say, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, remain this frequency. And so that tells you you're going to be sitting with the ground controller for a while. Maybe you're about to get a reroute. Maybe the weather's changed and they're dishing out reroutes, whatever the reason. So we'll do our frequency change to tower, and so then we call holding short, John Wayne Tower, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, short of 19 right, ready for takeoff. And we could get a myriad of responses there, but let's assume they let us go. It would be Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, John Wayne Tower, wind 180 at 4, runway 19 right, cleared for takeoff. And we read it back. Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, cleared for takeoff, 19 right. Now you could say 19 right, cleared for takeoff, or cleared for takeoff, 19 right. You say it any way you like. We don't care. We have to say it on the controlling side in a very specific way. The same is not true for you. Just make sure you include a runway number and a cleared for takeoff. So the runway number is important. If we've made a mistake and there are two Cessnas holding short, one over here and one over here, and the call signs are kind of similar, then you know, if you're the Cessna who is sitting over here and you don't quite hear the runway number, you just hear kind of your call sign. So all the links in the accident chain are building up, right? There's all these coincidences. There isn't any one of those coincidences that's particularly rare. So this could happen. And so what you need is something to break that accident chain. And so by you repeating the runway number on the takeoff, it may seem redundant to you. It is redundant, and it's a good thing. It can be the thing that ends up saving your life. So don't just say, okay, we're cleared to go, or okay, we're rolling, anything like that. Say 19 right, cleared for takeoff, or cleared for takeoff, 19 right. Make sure that runway number's in there. Okay, so we take off, and he didn't give us a pattern departure instruction. However, we do have a heading, a radar heading to be flown by the controller. I shouldn't say radar heading. That's not the correct word in this case. But we have an assigned heading to fly. So speed and altitude permitting, once we're on the go, got the plane cleaned up, and we're able to, we'd make a right turn to a heading of 330, and we'll be watching our altitude because they told us to remain at or below 2,400. So we're done with our facility diagram. How do we know to right? Good question. Well, if you're on a 190 heading, what's the shortest path to 330? ATC would be expecting you to go the shortest path. If they have an operational need to make you go the long way, they would say turn left heading 330. And you would be wise as pilot to question it, and they're not going to yell at you for questioning it. If you ever get a turn to the long way, we'll call the nickname for that is the long way around. So verify you want a left turn to 330, and you could accentuate the left part to really get their attention, and they'll either say, oh, I'm sorry, my mistake, right turn 330, or they'll say affirmative, yes, the long way around to 330, and then you do the left turn. Yeah, Brett, that's a good question. I don't think I knew that until recently. I saw something in the AIM about that regarding pattern altitude. So if you're in a standard traffic pattern, the question was, do you hold runway heading until the end of the airport to turn to 330? And for pattern work, someone asked me recently when you should turn crosswind, and the normal answer is when you're within 300 feet of pattern altitude, that's a good time to turn crosswind. However, what if it's a 10,000 foot runway? And you'll be up at cross at pattern altitude before reaching the end of that runway. I need to double check the AIM, but I think it says either within 300 feet of pattern altitude or once you get to the end of the runway, or maybe and. If it's and, then it's kind of important. Then you have to wait till you reach the end of the runway regardless of your altitude. I took off from a very long, I've taken off from very long runways in the past, and I have turned before the end of those runways before, right or wrong. So I'll try and find out the answer to that. That's actually a good one. So if you can remember to email me that question or bring it up again at the end, that would be helpful, and I'll try and find out the answer to it. If anyone knows, if anyone knows the definitive answer, feel free to write it down. Okay, so we're on the 330 heading, and this bizarre thing happens where they don't send us off to departure, but the next thing you hear is Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo radar contact. And so that's the tower, actually radar identifying you. And so we're on a 330 heading towards Anaheim Stadium. And if we were not receiving flight following, what would happen is right as we get to the outer core of the Charlie, notice the 2400 restriction. Anyone see any coincidences between 2400 and the 25 right here? They seem awfully close, right? Yeah. So Ryan, who's flown this a few times is now putting it all together as to why it's 2400. Yes, it's 2400 because they want to drop you like a hot potato once you get out of the inner core of the class Charlie, which is relatively rare, by the way. Standard operating procedure is to keep you for considerably longer than just the Charlie, believe it or not. There's an invisible shelf out here 20 miles away, or 20-mile circle, called the outer area, which is not depicted on any charts, and normally they're obliged to give you radar service all the way out to that. So even if you didn't request flight following, normally if you departed out of a field like John Wayne without requesting flight following, you'd be forgiven for thinking as soon as you're out of the Charlie, they're going to drop you like a hot potato. In fact, they should take you at least 20 miles before they drop you like a hot potato. But I guess because the airspace congestion, or for whatever reason, I'd like to find out why this is too, they will drop you like a hot potato right at the inner core, the edge of the inner core of the Charlie. So forget the outer area that's 20 miles long. They're not even getting you to the lateral bounds of the class Charlie. So if we weren't requesting flight following, right around here you'd hear Squawk VFR frequency change approved. When that happens, by the way, any altitude restrictions and headroom restrictions go away, and that seems relatively obvious, because if they're saying frequency change approved, you could turn your radio off theoretically and go fly. So an altitude and heading restriction wouldn't make sense at that point, because there'd be no way for you to get it canceled. So if for some reason they forget to say resume own navigation and resume appropriate VFR altitudes, the first of those cancels the heading, the second of those cancels the altitude. So own navigation, own VFR altitudes. If they forget to say all that, you can do it anyway because they've given you the frequency change. Mark, note we haven't looked into the TFR at Disneyland, and for time reasons I'm not gonna, I won't delve into that one yet. Okay, but that's not what's going to happen here. We are getting flight following because we said we wanted flight following to Ontario. So next I'm going to hear is contact SoCal departure on whatever frequency. Biz, you have either push to talk on or your voice activated. If you can mute your mic to make sure that you're not transmitting when you're not intending to, that would be good. Or just swap to push to talk. Okay, so we get handed over to SoCal departure on, in this case it'll be 127.2. Real world it might be something different. Their sector sizes are smaller than ours, but whatever it is, it'll be a frequency. We check in with them. SoCal approach, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, level 2,300 or 2,200, whatever you're on. Opinion is divided as to whether you should check in with the heading or not. You can believe that 330 is the standard heading out of here. You're not the first person in the world to be given a 330 heading out of John Wayne, northwestbound. So they'll know that you're on the 330 heading. So if you want to be ruthlessly efficient in your comms, and I do encourage you to be ruthlessly efficient in your comms, then you would just check in with literally that. SoCal approach, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, level 2,300. And that's it. Don't tell them you're going to Ontario. Don't tell them you're looking for advisories. They know that. You've already got the advisories. Don't tell them you're on the 330 heading. Don't tell them you're restricted out of below 2,400. All of that is completely standard. I guess in theory you could mention the restriction of out of below 2,400. That's relatively standard practice to check in with your current altitude and the altitude you're climbing to. Although I apologize, now that I've said that, level 2,300 is acceptable because you're no longer climbing or descending. So I was right the first time. No need to check in with a 2,400 restriction. And you'll then hear Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, SoCal approach, John Wayne altimeter 3012, resume navigation and appropriate VFR altitudes. That is assuming, of course, there isn't a jet bearing down upon John Wayne on the right downwind for the ILS-19 right. So they may not just lift you right up into the Charlie. They may still give you some kind of restriction, but let's assume for now they don't and they cut you loose. I'm not going to repeat the navigation side of things. We've already done that, and I do want to keep it moving. So the next thing that's going to happen is we turn, we start navigating, we climb. They might ask you, what altitude did you want to climb to again, or say requested altitude. SoCal 3 Alpha Bravo is requesting 3,000, or we're planning 3,000. However you'd like to respond. So we climb to that altitude. The class Charlie has disappeared, as we said, so forget about it and just navigate the airplane. At some point you'll get a frequency change over to Ontario. If you had a COM2 radio that you could check the ATIS on, I would do that. You can Imagine there are not, because it's such a short flight, the person who's working, the next person you're likely to talk to is the approach controller for this area, and it would be helpful to let them know you have the ATIS so that they don't have to teach you the full weather when you check in. So when they say contacts SoCal approach 135.4, which is what you're likely to get, it's okay, over to 35.4 for Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo. Then you check in with them. So in the background, if you can, you've picked up the ATIS and you know that it's Delta, for example. And so you would say, SoCal approach, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, level 3000, landing with Delta. They'll, I think they still will give you the altimeter. I need to double check that. That's a fundamental thing, but I've kind of gone back and forth on it. But if you check in with the ATIS, perhaps they don't have to give the altimeter. Ryan, you seem like one of those ATC types. If you can type that at some point, if they check in with the ATIS, are you still obliged to give the altimeter or not? All right, I'll let you think about it. Okay, and so the decision making here is regarding the Chino. This is the thing which gets everyone fairly hot and bothered. So it is worth understanding this airspace right here. So we're at 3000. Are we inside or above the Chino delta? Right. Are we going to get 3,000 feet forever? Right. Initially we're good, we're above it, but looking ahead at what's coming up, at some point we're going to have to descend. Ontario is around 1,000 feet. Planet pattern altitude of 1,000 AGL, so you're looking at roughly ballpark 2,000 feet for the pattern altitude. So you'll be coming down from 3 to 2 at some point. There are two ways of making this happen. You can make a conscious effort to remain above 2,700 feet until you're clear of the Chino delta. The Chino delta is not a perfect circle. You'll notice their delta stops here. It doesn't continue in a circle here. Even if it did, it wouldn't matter because it would be trumped by the Ontario class Charlie, which comes down to the surface. So if a chart designer, just so you know this, and this is kind of important because it happens from time to time, if the chart designer forgot to get rid of this circle, you might be confused for thinking, okay, well if I'm at 2,500 feet, am I in the delta or am I in the Charlie? Because they're conflicting, they're overlapping. Thankfully, the regulations tell you what to do in that case, and the most restrictive airspace takes precedent over the less restrictive airspace. So let's, again, pretend there was a circle here. That would imply that from the surface to 2,700 is the Chino Delta, which is certainly true over here at the shopping center. It's hard to imagine there's only one shopping center in Southern California, but apparently it must be a big one. So at 2,700 feet, we have a question to ask, or 2,500 feet, there's a question. Are we in the Delta or are we in the Charlie? The answer is we're in the Charlie because they are conflicting, because this one's surface to 5 and this one's surface to 27 and below. Sorry, surface to 27 but not including because of the minus sign. The answer is would be in the Charlie. So one way of thinking about it is I'm just going to stay above 2,700 until the Whispering Lakes golf course. That's viable. That's one way of doing it. The other thing to take into account is that by talking to ATC, one card you have in your back pocket is there's a rule that says that ATC, if you're receiving radar services, which you are from the SoCal approach controller here, he or she is obliged to coordinate any of your transitions through any Delta airspace. I don't think that's in any of the pilot regulations, but it does not. It certainly is in the ATC regulations. So you can reasonably descend through that airspace. Now you might want to let them know, hey, we're going to clip the Delta or something like that. But you don't have to be terrified of going through the Delta. You certainly don't have to request a frequency change to Chino Tower, and that's usually the big question people have is, should I change over to Chino Tower if I'm going to clip that airspace? And the answer is no, you don't have to, because by law, the approach controller has already coordinated that for you. It's reasonable, they know you're landing at Ontario, they know you're going to descend, so you're good to go. Here's where it would be less reasonable to do that. If you're transitioning from over here at this mountain to El Monte, so over here. So we're starting over here, we're going over there, and we tell them we're going to go at 4,500. And you're talking to SoCal Approach. You enter the Charlie at 4,500. They're probably not going to tell the Chino Tower that you're there. because they have no reason to expect you to be descending below 2,700 feet anyway. So they may not have coordinated it. So if you suddenly, without warning, just plummet down to 2,000 feet and say, oh, well, I know that you coordinated it because I've got radar services with you, that's, I don't know if that's going to fly. I don't know if they would have coordinated it for you in such a case. They'll probably question you about it as soon as you descend. But again, in this case, it's perfectly reasonable that you would be descending for the pattern at Ontario. So feel free to do the descent. The other thing to keep in your back pocket, and this is in the Instrument Flying Handbook, I believe. It may be in the VFR one, but I haven't read that one lately. But in the FAA's Instrument Flying Handbook, there's a spectacular description that says that while you're receiving radar service, the tops of a lot of delta airspace, when there's an approach controller that lives right over the top of a delta, the letter of agreement, or the SOP, between the Chino Tower and the SoCal approach facility that works this area, there'll be a letter of agreement that says that even though the chart says that it's Chino Tower from surface to 2,700, guess what? The LOA may actually say, you know what, we're going to relinquish the top 500 feet of our delta and give that to SoCal approach. The reason they do that is so that as airplanes are transitioning, and this happens not infrequently, that they'd be coming to land at Ontario, rather than the SoCal approach controller having to get on the phone every single time a plane is going to maybe hit the Chino Delta, they just relinquish the control of the top 500 feet of airspace. So what you might hear from the SoCal approach controller, so he doesn't have to make a phone call. You know, let's assume that SoCal actually owns 2,200 and above in the Chino Delta. What you might hear is Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo maintain at or above 2,200. So that way you can still transition through the Delta, but they're making sure you don't go any lower than that, because that would have had to have been coordinated with Chino Tower. Or maintain at or above 2,200 until north of Chino, something along those lines. So those are the different ways that can play out, and that's what's going on in the background if you're curious. Ryan, okay, thanks for that. Let's see, is it regulation to confirm ATIS with approach before entering tower territory? They are going to, if you don't check in with it, as I said before, when you say SoCal approach Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo level 3000 landing with Delta, if you forget the landing with Delta part or the we have the numbers part, then they are going to say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo advise you have Delta. In the real world, they might ask you to advise that you have Delta. If you don't, if you're unable to get it or there isn't time, if you say negative ATIS, you can specifically check in with negative ATIS. That's a reasonable phrase to use. It's published as well. If there simply wasn't time to get the ATIS for whatever reason, you can just check in with negative ATIS and fess up right away, and they will typically read the ATIS to you if possible. So yes, that'll all be sorted out with the approach controller. Tower is generally, if you're being handed off from approach to tower, I don't think the tower is going to care so much. If you're cold calling the tower, if you came out of Rialto to land at Ontario, they're going to make sure you have the ATIS. But if you're handed off from the radar controller, I don't think the tower is going to insist on you having the ATIS. I think they're going to assume that you have it. So we're going to be looking to get the field in sight. Either SoCal will be proactive and say advise when you have Ontario in sight, or if you're getting a little bit fidgety because you don't want to be talking to SoCal anymore, you really want to be talking to Ontario because you're kind of going fast and you kind of see a lot of planes down there, and you'd really love to know what your pattern sequencing is going to look like. You know, and maybe you hear the approach controller starting to get into it with a guy shooting an instrument approach at Riverside who's not doing the right thing. Maybe he's getting distracted. It would be a good time to say, hey, we've got Ontario in sight, you know, when you can get a word in. And they'll say, okay, contact Ontario Tower and whatever the frequency is. Let me swap back over to the TAC. There we go. Okay, so contact Ontario Tower 120.6. And let's see, the approach controller, this varies. They may tell you what runway to expect and what pattern entry to expect. So they might say, hey, plan for a left downwind. Right when you check in with them initially, they might actually say plan for a left downwind or plan for a left base, or plan to cross overhead and enter a right downwind for 26 right. You know, that you might get a heads up from the approach controller, or you might not. They might literally say nothing about what to expect in Ontario and simply hand you off to the tower. So don't be too fixated on getting a specific pattern entry from the approach control. It's not going to happen that way every time. It's going to vary. But at some point, you'll get a pattern entry instruction. So it'll either be from approach or from tower. So you check in with tower, Ontario Tower System 123 Alpha Bravo, and you can assume that they're a radar, that they have some sort of radar feed. You might want to just tell them what your altitude is. And so we're descending through 2,700. You're not going to a specific altitude in that case, so I wouldn't say, we're at 2,700 for whatever the field elevation is. Don't hold on too rigidly to the idea that you have to check in with your target altitude when you're at the tower in this case. So say descending through 2,700. And they'll give you, as I said, any one of those pattern entry instructions. It could be traffic on the left crosswind, remaining in the patterns of Skyhawk, advise when you have them in sight. So there could be a person doing pattern work here at Ontario, and they may want you to spot it so that you can fall in behind them. Or it could be direct to the numbers. I'm not going to go through all the different pattern entry instructions, but it could be any number of things. Most likely just enter a left downwind runway 26 left. And then you'll get your landing clearance, and then I'm not going to do the facility diagram and everything because we're running out of time. So you'll land, get your landing clearance, swap to ground potentially. We already talked about the tower and ground dilemma in previous workshop as to whether you'll be handed over to them or monitor or just remain this frequency. Any one of those three things could happen, and then the flight is over. I'm determined not to have a part 4, but something tells me it might end up happening. Okay. So I know I was going a little bit quick at the end there, but any major concerns about the communications that happened on that flight, or any of the decisions or the branches that we talked about? Do they kind of make sense, or is there anything major that I missed? Okay. Ryan, I'm going to ask you to hold on to that. So Ryan has his question on has my answer for the altimeter, but because I'm running out of time, I will look at that later. Okay, that's the V2. Well, we took an hour and 20 minutes to do the V2. Hour and 15 because we started a little bit late. All right, well, I'll tell you what. I've promised in the past that we'll take a break because I know I moved quickly. Let us take just a 3-minute break. I know that's specific, but let's do 3 minutes, and then we're going to begin our class Bravo action.